Good morning, class. Everybody take your seats. I'll hand out the short story sheets and we can start our short story today. Uh, just kidding. It's Mr. Corbett coming to you live from the studio known as my bedroom. And I just wanted to say hello to everybody. And I had some student requests that I read the story like we would in class. Some kids told me they get more out of it. If that's you and you feel like you want to listen along while I read, great. If not, no problem. I'll do my commentary thing like we would if we were in class, and feel free to read along or ignore. Okay, so the story we're reading is called Babylon Revisited, and it's written by a guy named F. Scott Fitzgerald. The setting is shortly after World War One, and you have to understand World War One was kind of a turning point in human history. It was the most deadly war up to that point. In fact, they didn't call it World War One because they didn't know there was going to be a World War Two. They called it the Great War because it was the greatest war ever. And I don't mean that in a good way, but I mean in terms of how many people lost their lives. Over 25 million people died in World War One. They also had, going around towards the end of the war, the Spanish flu, which also killed millions of people worldwide, and it was a horrible time in human history in terms of our human growth. Now, after the war, a group of writers all took up residence, moved to Paris, and many of them began living together. F. Scott Fitzgerald being one of them, along with Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, I believe Catherine Ann Porter. There are some others I'm blanking on, but they became known as the Lost Generation, mostly because their writing kind of reflected this new attitude that humanity had kind of lost its humanness in this war by allowing so many people to die needlessly on the battlefield. So, in the Great War. So that's where the story takes place, in Paris after World War One. Our main character, his name is Charlie Wales, and I don't believe he was actually in the army, but he was in Paris. What happened was, after the war ended, a lot of soldiers stayed on, and they could take a vacation, a furlough, some time off in Paris or in other capitals of Europe to kind of decompress from the war. So Paris kind of became like an American city for a little while, as thousands of American soldiers kind of lit up the nightlife and hung out around Paris. And it was a big economic boost for Paris because the soldiers were paying in American money, which was very valuable. In fact, in the story, you'll see one of the things that they say is you could get back in the day, you could get a 5-course dinner, I think, for 18 American cents. That's pretty cheap, even by 1919 standards. So our story takes place a few years after the war ends, and after this time period where the Americans partied it up in Paris for a while, and then they've all gone home, and now Paris has kind of gone back to the French, and it's no longer the bustling has the bustling nightlife it used to when the Americans were there. Okay, so in the title, Babylon Revisited, is kind of symbolic. Babylon was a city that the center of the Babylonian civilization, which rose to power quickly and also went out of power quickly. So it's kind of ironic, symbolic more, that Paris rose very quickly and then fell off very quickly in terms of its nightlife and its economy right after the war. It became booming with Americans after the war, and then it slowed way down. So that's the setting for our story and our main character, Charlie. It begins with something, a technique called in media res, which means in the midst of things. So the story just starts and you feel like, wait, what? Did I miss a page? What happened here? It's like when a movie starts and all of a sudden you're just in a car chase and you don't know what's going on. You're like, why are these guys chasing each other? And you don't really know what's happening. That's how the story kind of starts. And where's Mr. Campbell? Charlie asked. Going to Switzerland. Mr. Campbell, he's a pretty sick man, Mr. Wales. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. And George Hart? Charlie inquired. Oh, he's back in America, gone to work. And where's the snowbird? Oh, he was in here last week. Anyway, his friend Mr. Schaefer's in Paris. Two familiar names from the long list of a year and a half ago. Charlie scribbled an address in his notebook and tore out the page. If you see Mr. Schaefer, give him this, said Charlie. It's my brother-in-law's address. I haven't settled on a hotel yet. He was not really disappointed to find Paris was so empty, but the stillness in the Ritz bar was strange and portentous. It was not an American bar anymore. He felt polite in it, and not as if he owned it. It had gone back into France. He felt the stillness from the moment he got out of the taxi and saw the doorman, usually in a frenzy of activity at this hour, gossiping with a chauffeur by the servants' entrance. Passing through the corridor, he heard only a single bored voice in the once clamorous women's room. When he turned into the bar, he traveled the 20 feet of green carpet with his eyes fixed straight ahead by an old habit, and then, with his foot firmly on the rail, he turned and surveyed the room, encountering only a single pair of eyes that fluttered up from a newspaper in the corner. Charlie asked for the head barman, Paul, who in the latter days of the bull market had come to work in his own custom-built car, disembarking, however, with due nicety at the nearest corner. But Paul was at his country house today, and Alex giving him information. No more, Charlie said. I'm going slow these days. Alex congratulated him. You were going pretty strong a couple years ago. Oh, I'll stick to it all right, Charlie assured him. I've stuck to it for over a year and a half now. Well, how do you find conditions in America? Oh, I haven't been to America for months. I'm in business in Prague, representing a couple of concerns there. They don't know about me down there. Prague, by the way, is a city in the Czech Republic, which would be several hundred miles from Paris, in Europe. Alex smiled. You remember the night of George Hart's bachelor dinner here, said Charlie. And by the way, what's become of Claude Fessenden? Alex lowered his voice confidentially. He's in Paris, but he doesn't come here anymore. Paul won't allow it. He ran up a bill of 30,000 francs, charging all his drinks and lunches and usually his dinner for more than a year. And when Paul finally told him he had to pay up, he gave him a bad check. Alex shook his head sadly. I don't understand it. Such a dandy fella. Now he's all bloated up. He made a plump apple of his hands. Charlie watched a group of strident queens installing themselves in a corner. Nothing affects them, he thought. Stocks rise and fall, people loaf for work, but they go on forever. Okay. Politically correct way to say this. Strident queens would be ladies of the night who are unaffected by any economy. That's what Charlie's thinking to himself. Hookers. Okay. The place oppressed him. He called for the dice and shook with Alex for the drink. Here for long, Mr. Wales? Oh, I'm here 4 or 5 days to see my little girl. Oh, you have a little girl. Outside, the fire-red, gas-blue, ghost-green signs shone smokily through the tranquil rain. It was late afternoon, and the streets were in movement. The bistros gleamed. At the corner of the Boulevard des Capucines, he took a taxi. The Place de la Concorde moved by in pink majesty. They crossed the logical scene, and Charlie felt the sudden provincial quality of the left bank. Charlie directed his taxi to the Avenue de l'Opera, which was out of his way, but he wanted to see the blue hour spread over the magnificent facade and imagine that the cab horns, playing endlessly the first few bars of La Plus Coulente, were the trumpets of the Second Empire. They were closing the iron grill in front of Brentano's bookstore, and people were already at dinner behind the trim little bourgeois hedge of Duval's. He had never eaten at a really cheap restaurant in Paris. 5-course dinner, 4 francs 50, 18 cents, wine included. For some odd reason, he wished that he had. As they rolled on to the left bank, and he felt its sudden provincialism, he thought, I spoiled this city for myself. I didn't realize it, but the days came along one after another, then 2 years were gone, and everything was gone, and I was gone. He was 35 and good to look at. The Irish mobility of his face was sobered by a deep wrinkle between his eyes. As he rang his brother-in-law's bell in the Rue Palatine, the wrinkle deepened till it pulled down his brows. He felt a cramping sensation in his belly. From behind the maid who opened the door darted a lovely little girl of 9 who shrieked, Daddy! And flew up, struggling like a fish, into his arms. She pulled his head around by one ear and set her cheek against his. My old pie, he said. Oh, Daddy, 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 Dads, Dads, Dads. She drew him into the salon where the family waited, a boy and girl his daughter's age, his sister-in-law and her husband. He greeted Marion with his voice pitched carefully to avoid either feigned enthusiasm or dislike, but her response was more frankly tepid, though she minimized her expression of unalterable distrust by directing her regard toward his child. The two men clasped hands in a friendly way, and Lincoln Peters rested his for a moment on Charlie's shoulder. So these are his wife. Charlie's wife's name is Helen, and her sister is Marion. So that's who he's visiting. And Marion is married to Lincoln. Marion and Lincoln have two children. I forget their names. They're not major characters. You don't have to write them down, but or fill them in on the sheet. But also, they are, for some reason, they have Honoria, his daughter, Charlie's daughter. We don't know why, but they are watching Honoria for some reason. The room was warm and comfortably American. The three children moved intimately about, playing through the yellow oblongs that led to other rooms. The cheer of 6 o'clock spoke in the eager smacks of the fire and the sounds of French activity in the kitchen. I just lost my spot. But Charlie did not relax. His heart sat up rigidly in his body, and he drew confidence from his daughter, who, from time to time, came close to him, holding in her arms the doll he had brought. Really, extremely well, he declared in answer to Lincoln's question. There's a lot of business there that isn't moving at all, but we're doing even better than ever. In fact, damn well. I'm bringing my sister over from America next month to keep house for me. My income last year was larger than it was when I had money. You see, the check... His boasting was for a specific purpose. But after a moment, seeing a faint restiveness in Lincoln's eyes, he changed the subject. And those are fine children of yours, well brought up, good manners. Well, we think Honoria's a great little girl, too, said Lincoln. Marion Peters came back in from the kitchen. She was a tall woman with